Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Jin-Gitaxais Progress Tyrant. This is a donation deck that comes from Xavier, thank you for supporting the channel. They say, I think this deck is pretty tight, but it's definitely weak to being ganged up on, which inevitably happens, and can have some slow starts. I'd like help with suggestions on how to help it hit the ground running a little quicker. No restrictions, go nuts. Absolutely, there's a lot of things we could be doing with Jin-Gitaxais, and I love Jin-Gitaxais Progress Tyrant. It's a very, very divisive commander, and I do tend to like that. The deck list itself is already really, really strong, but I've got a few suggestions and a few nitpicks that I think will make it a little better. But let's start off by taking a look at our commander, and since this version of the commander is written in Phyrexian, let's go over to the other page to see it. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Jin-Gitaxais Progress Tyrant, and what makes them so divisive as a particularly strong mono-blue commander? Jin-Gitaxais is a 7-mana 5/5 legendary Phyrexian Praetor with two abilities, and two very, very powerful abilities. The first one is whenever you cast an artifact, instance, or sorcery, you copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. This only triggers once each turn. And on the flip side, as the Praetors, the way that they work, at least traditionally, because the flip Praetors don't work this way, but that same ability is reflected negatively onto your opponents, and it says whenever an opponent casts an artifact, instant, or sorcery spell, counter that spell. This ability triggers only once each turn. Now, we got to be really careful with the wording on that second one, because I think it's easy to misunderstand how it works because of how we might think it works in 1v1, where it would trigger for each opponent separately, but that's not the case. The case is that if one opponent triggers this by casting, a draw spell or a counter spell, and Jin-Gitaxais counters that spell, then the next spell one of your other opponents, or even that opponent casts, will come through. So two opponents working together can get around this restriction fairly easily. If I was playing a board clear, even on my own turn, I can see if one of my opponents is willing to throw out, a removal spell at instant speed, let Jin-Gitaxais counter that spell, and then play the board clear, hopefully getting rid of Jin-Gitaxais and anything else. Now, this isn't necessarily like a big problem. Jin-Gitaxais' abilities are still really, really strong, even if they're not as insane as one might think. It does open up certain play groups to it. Certain play groups, and I know everyone knows their play groups, so some of you will agree with me on this, are more inclined to help each other and have a game where teamwork is a main part of the game, or are more selfish, where their only interest is defeating their opponents, and any kind of interaction or any kind of deal struck is always so that they can win. Jin-Gitaxais is better in the latter. When your opponents are selfish, Jin-Gitaxais does more work. And the longer Jin-Gitaxais stays on the battlefield, the more work he does, right? Every counter spell countered, every spell doubled is just kind of rocketing you ahead in victory, and therefore we want to make the most of this ability. And a lot of this deck is already kind of tuned to do that, which I really, really do appreciate. We've got a lot of really good low mana interaction that when doubled or just used to protect Jin-Gitaxais is rather, rather good. We have counter spells, we have removal. We also have a bunch of cards that get really, really good, like High Tide when they are doubled. High Tide turns, each island to tap for 2 blue, but if you double High Tide, now they tap for 3 blue, and that can be a huge boost in power for the rest of the turn. And in those kind of ways, I really do like it. Now, we also have a lot of artifacts, because we got to remember it's instant, sorcery, and artifact cards that get doubled. But one of the first places I wanted to point out, something that's interesting in the deck, is that almost all of these cards are mana-oriented, and not much more than that. Obviously, cards like Isochron Scepter can be good, can be really, really interesting, and can kind of take over a game. But once again, these are cards that rely a lot on your hand, they rely on the situation. So though these are good, the majority of the cards we're looking at is ramp. Not bad, but not really what we want to be doubling. Looking at our artifacts, in our creature zone, which is a pretty strong place to be, Psychosis Crawler is very notable of being very, very strong in doubles. Spellskite is fine, but most likely will come down before Jin-Gitaxais, and that's kind of it. So really, we're using our Jin-Gitaxais in our instance and sorcery section to get a little more bang for our buck, let's say. And the thing is though I really like this, we've got ourselves kind of in a situation where almost all of our instance and sorceries are reactive primarily and proactive secondly. Like I did that, I explained High Tide being really, really good, but High Tide is proactive in the sense that it enables the next thing you do. Likewise, things like Blue Sun Zenith is a proactive spell that you can cast, but just enables the rest of the deck to function. And you could have really, really cool turns when you use, like, you know, High Tide into Blue Sun Zenith, and then, you know, make someone draw their entire deck. But even that gets a little clunky because you remember that unless we're casting Jin-Gitaxais halfway through, we can't really double Blue Sun Zenith with the High Tide, right? High Tide either gets doubled or we just don't have Jin-Gitaxais and the Blue Sun Zenith is just used once. So it's a little tricky to make these kind of big aggressive plays in a deck like this, especially when you're so incentivized to be constantly vigilant in protecting Jin-Gitaxais. And I think this is something Xavier pointed out, that there is a bit of fragility in the deck. And this is something I want to kind of point out, that that kind of fragility is okay. This is something maybe people who play one-on-one or competitive formats understand a little more, but there is this mentality that your deck can't beat everything. And in one-on-one, that is usually like you have bad matchups or you have weak points and you just kind of take the L on them, right? You can put sideboard cards to help those matchups, but eventually you just have to give in and say, you know what, I'm probably very unlikely to win, I'll just play my best. Commander has that a little differently. One, obviously we don't have sideboards, so we don't really have ways to change our deck mid-game, but not only are there going to be certain decks that your deck is just weak to, there's going to be certain strategies by players and strategies by the table that your deck is weak to, right? There are certain decks that show up and say, hey, if you don't take me seriously, I'm going to beat all of you. I've played against these kind of decks, I've played these kind of decks, they're very fun, but they require a certain kind of, you know, mentality to play. Jin-Gitaxais is one of those decks, especially the Progress Tyrant. The Core Augur is close, and I'm very interested in the Core, which for people who don't know, because it's Phyrexian here, this is the one that draws 7 cards at the end of your turn, and each opponent's maximum hand is reduced by 7, so therefore at the end of each opponent's turn, they discard the entirety of their hand. Also very, very divisive, also really strong, especially with Flash, but these commanders, you know, they inspire fear in our opponents. That's not even including what I would call the mono blue tax. If a mono blue player sits at your table and goes, hey, I'm here to play, everyone kind of treats them suspiciously. They know that the mono blue player has to be playing counter spells to a certain extent, otherwise they can't really interact with their opponents, and therefore will play as if that opponent has every interaction piece and every counter spell ever, and hate that player out of the game. This isn't universal, but it's something I have noticed a lot. I think something that's also really, really interesting is that this deck kind of leans into that by running all of this counter magic all of the time. Okay, we've talked a lot about this. Let's talk about a few cards that I think are worth noting. But before that, let's check our mana base and curve. Should have started there, but it's nice to come back to it. We have 35 lands, 37 with MDFCs. Our 2 MDFCs are Sink into Stupor and Seagate Restoration. 2 cards that are really, really strong in this deck and therefore are really, really nice to use as cards and not necessarily as lands. And we do have a lot of really, really good ramp early on with Mana Vault, with Chrome Mox, with Mox Amber. Now, Mox Amber is a little tougher because this one comes in, and this is probably, while we're still talking about mana, one of the cards that I do want to cut. It is a legendary artifact, so doubling it doesn't really do much, but at its base level, it is a card that requires a legendary creature or planeswalker you control. Let's count them. We have Narset, that's 1, Baral, that's 2, Tarlan, that's 3, and I think just the other Jin-Gitaxais. So that's 4 plus our commander, that's 5 cards that turn on Mox Amber. Now, let's think about that a little more seriously. How many of these cards would you not consider to be usable with Mox Amber? Well, Jin-Gitaxias Core Augur is 10 mana. So most of the game, that Mox Amber in your hand and that Jin-Gitaxias in your hand are actually not friends because they're just not going to work out. And getting an extra free mana at 10 mana, not really that interesting. Likewise, even our commander at 7 mana doesn't feel particularly strong when it enables Mox Amber. So with that in mind, unless we're keeping hands with Baral, which we can, but like, this Mox Amber is particularly weak and I think an easy cut. It also kind of, I want to just limit the kind of cards that makes everyone in the room sweat. And Mox Amber is one of those cards that you play Mox Amber and everyone goes, oh, Xavier's got more free mana, we need to take them out. You don't want that attitude. You want people to be like, oh, okay, they're just ramping slowly, it'll be fine, or they're ramping fairly by playing mana. So having a card that not only scares your opponents but doesn't do anything in the meantime, I think is an easy cut. Looking at the rest of the list, let's look at the curve here. We can see our curve is very, very heavy on 2s and 3s, especially on 2s. Now this makes a lot of sense because as we look, a lot of our 2s are interaction. And I will say to a certain extent, there is some interaction here that I think is not quite the same level as everything else, right? Looking at a card such as Memory Lapse, which is not a bad card, it just feels particularly weaker compared to all of the other options here. Arcane Denial, Counterspell, Mana Drain, right? Even Muddle the Mixture and Narset's Reversal, right? And for that reason, I think a card like Memory Lapse can easily be cut here. But also, if you'd ask me if I had the means, I would try to maybe diversify a few of these spells here because we're really, really hard on the 2 mana section and the 3 mana section. Now in the 1 mana, we still have a lot of really good interaction cards from Flusterstone to Pongify, Rapid Hybridization, Strict Serenade, all really great cards. We could probably play the other one, Swan Song as well should be in here. But, you know, looking at the instance here, we can kind of see we've funneled ourselves into a big 2 mana situation where 2 mana is also the turn where we get to play a lot of mana rocks. Sapphire Medallion, that's pretty strong, and even Baral is on the same kind of level. So it feels like we're going to be a little stressed with our mana, because think about it like this. When 2 mana is our highest mana value in the deck, in our curve, I should say, what happens is that our even turns are the strongest ones, right? Because on turn 2, we get to play one of these spells. On turn 4, we get to play 2 of these spells. And at turn 6, we get to play 3 of those spells, right? And this kind of works really well when we see the rest of the deck. Like we look at 4, we have Talrand, a card we're probably not casting if we don't have an additional cast that turn. So we can actually imagine Talrand as a 6 or 8 mana card. Fact or Fiction, which is just a very strong card, so that's fine, but we're probably not just throwing it out there. And Teferi's Puzzle Box, a really, really strong card that goes alongside like Narset. We have, I don't think I pointed out, but Narset Parter of Veils is a big combo in the deck where a lot of cards can lock your opponents from drawing any cards for the, like discarding their entire hands. So that's particularly good here and a good value card most of the time. But these are cards that we don't just throw out turn 4. So once again, we're incentivized by looking at this that we want to play 2 2-mana spells on turn 4. Likewise, turn 6 is very, very similar. So just good to kind of see the deck like this. Now, this isn't a problem. I think this is a really, really good part of the deck. I think the thing that kind of makes me think like twice about this is how much the 3 mana area is also filled up, right? Now we have this problem that, well, if 3 mana is our highest mana cost in the deck, we are looking at a deck that now wants to play on turns by 3. So on 3 mana, you get to cast 1, 6 mana, you get to cast 2, 9 mana, you get to cast 3. And 3 mana spells tend to be much stronger than 2 mana spells. I know it's dumb to say that out loud, but it's just something that we have to wrap our brains around sometimes. Like, Rhystic Study is way, way stronger than most of our 2 mana spells. So with that in mind, we have two kind of shells of the deck competing, especially at the 6 mana slot, right? 6 mana is now the slot where we're trying to decide if we want to cast 3 2-mana spells or 2 3-mana spells, or Consecrated Sphinx, which is also an insanely strong card. Do you see kind of what I'm getting at? I'm not trying to suggest like these cards are notoriously bad or not good enough. In fact, a lot of these cards are really, really strong. And that's why I really do understand why they're in the deck. All of these cards enable you to keep going, but we're getting to a point that we're stressing the deck out in ways it probably does not need to be stressed out in. We are getting in our own way, especially a deck that's trying to get off of the ground running, as Xavier wanted. It is unnecessary for us to be getting in our way so much when our opponents are more keen on doing this. Without naming a lot of specific cards, I think it's just worth considering what the deck brings in and where we can kind of reduce these stressors. I think it's easy to just say, take out some 3-drops, but make sure the shape of the deck is still rather functional. Something that kind of catches my eye, let's just look at 3-drops, is cards such as Fabricate. You know I love tutors, I really do love tutors, but this seems to be a particularly weak tutor in this deck, even though it grabs great cards such as Scepter, allowing us to go Scepter, Dramatic Reversal, and have infinite mana. It lets us grab Sapphire Medallion, which is very powerful in the deck. It lets us get Teferi's Puzzle Box if we have Narset, etc., etc. Very, very powerful card, but still, I would say one of the weaker cards in the deck. It's just kind of clunky in a deck that's otherwise so smooth. And though we could say, well, Cursed, if I have Jin-Gitaxais out, that's 2 tutors for 3 mana, and I'm going to say, that's great, but I don't know, I don't really want that to be the spell I'm casting, you know? It's sorcery speed, which is clunky, which means I really want to hold up like Flusterstorm or something to protect Jin-Gitaxais. And perhaps, I didn't put in my additions, but perhaps that's something worth considering, that you might want to be running things like Slip Out the Back or other protection spells, so you need a little additional mana. And so instead and we might want to copy those, and so instead we're casting Fabricate. I don't know, I'd rather like copy Blue Sun Zenith, I'd rather copy Frantic Search, cards like that that enable us to go much deeper, much faster, instead of getting at sorcery speed 2 cards that we probably can't cast that turn anyways. Likewise, Solve the Equation, same kind of logic here, though I will admit Solve the Equation is way stronger in this deck. It is still a rather clunky card that I feel like it's just asking for trouble, because either, and you know what, let's also word it like this. Solve the Equation and Fabricate are cards that are okay in this deck. They are overcosted tutors that are going to pull very reactive cards out of your deck, or 1 or 2 combo cards, very specifically combo cards with Narset. So they're very specific cards that are slow and clunky. And the thing that makes them even harder to use is, when do you use them, right? Do you use them leading up to Jin-Gitaxais, or do you keep them until after Jin-Gitaxais? Because they are clunky and not great spells, but when Jin-Gitaxais is out, they're very much so, they're very much stronger. I don't know if that's English. They're much stronger. They become divinations that tutor for any card within their parameters from the deck. That's really good. But then you're keeping this card in your hand the entire game to use with Jin-Gitaxais, and I've already pointed out that that's not particularly strong. They're just clunky. And these kind of cards are the ones I want you to be aware of their clunkiness. Very easily, another 2 here, though one's more of a personal choice than other, is Imprisoned in the Moon. Imprisoned in the Moon is a really strong card, don't get me wrong. It is a way of taking someone's commander out of the game. And if you target, for example, the black-red player, that might be for the entire, that might be like forever, you know, whereas like a green-white player might be able to disenchant it. For most players, this just might be it, right? And that's really impressive, but once again, that 3 mana feels just clunkier over like Witness Protection, or I think there's that new Unable to Scream is one I really like. Yeah, they don't have the same permanency as Imprisoned in the Moon, but they will buy you the time to keep going instead of, you know, taking your valuable mana in your lead up turns to cast this instead, right? I'm gonna say this one more time and we're probably gonna move on. I think I've made my point, but it's worth reiterating. I explained how with a deck with high amount of 2 mana, 2, 4, 6 important turns, 3 mana, 3, 6, 9, right? Imprisoned in the Moon, if you're gonna cast this anywhere within that section, it gets tricky because it eats up a lot of your options. Obviously, the best turn to be casting this is 5, because you can cast Imprisoned from the Moon in the Moon, and then you can hold up 2 mana for your other spells. But that's just one of those turns. On all of the other turns, they severely complicate your mana choices. So on turn 4, you're left with all your 1 mana spells, which there are a lot, but don't have the same interactive power as your 2 mana spells. On turn 6, it means you've committed to casting either another 3 mana spell or just 1 2 mana spell, whereas before you had the options of casting 3 2 mana spells, right? Like every one of these decisions is a huge decision and is making it difficult for you to get to the mana base or the mana level you need to slam Jin-Gitaxais. And though I haven't said this yet and I should have led with this, also really important to consider that Jin-Gitaxais is not necessarily 7 mana, because they require you to have either additional mana or a free spell to immediately take advantage of that first ability. You want to play Jin-Gitaxais, and as soon as they resolve and he's on the battlefield, you want to cast another spell. Get that copy, because otherwise, if you go to pass your turn and someone goes, wastes 2 spells to get rid of Jin-Gitaxais, yes, you are ahead, but now you've lost your commander, and you've gotten minimal amounts of let's say value out of it. You basically used it as a mind rot where one of your opponents discarded 2 cards. Not worth 7 mana. Okay, with that in mind, let's go into my additions. As we go, after I've been very specific on the kind of mana values, I'm worried that these are all going to be 3 and 2 mana cards. I don't remember, but let's go into them anyways. So, Tyrant Dynamo's here to kind of sit in for a number of cards. And this is the idea of artifact-based ramp. Now, you're already playing a lot of them, and there's some good 2 mana ones, and you're playing some good 1 mana ones, you're even playing some 0 mana ones, but I wanted to be specific in the ones that are more mana positive or stronger that come out later in the game. Tyrant Dynamo, for 4 mana, ramps you 3. This is phenomenal because that's Jin-Gitaxian mana, right? You start off with 4, you play this, you untap, you have 7, you play another island, that represents 1 other spell you could play, you play Jin-Gitaxian and maybe Jin-Gitaxias, and maybe you hold up, I don't know, Brainstorm and immediately get to cast 2 Brainstorms. Anything like that, right? So cards that provide more mana are really, really strong. Another one I think is probably worth talking about would be the Worn Power Stone, because once again, for 3 mana, gives you 2 mana, is also a pretty good deal. Both of these cards get even better when they're copied, so you don't really mind these being your artifact spells, because Tyrant Dynamo being copied represents 6 mana that you have access to immediately. I forgot to say that. This is immediate access, so you could cast another artifact on the turn you play this, but with, with Jin-Gitaxias out, this is 6 mana, colorless immediately, which is very, very powerful, and that mana allows you to just keep going. Whereas something like, I don't know, I don't think you're playing Arcane Signet, but you are. You don't need to. You could just play any mana rock that taps for blue. But let's say Arcane Signet is only giving you 1 additional mana. You're actually just being mana neutral when you cast Arcane Signet, and that's if you want to use it with Jin-Gitaxian's ability, right? You probably want to cast something else first. So Arcane Signet, unlike, the cards that I was saying beforehand, where are they? The Fabricate and the other sorcery, where is it? The Solve the Equation cards, where you're very much so incentivized to hold on to them and maybe cast them after Jin-Gitaxias. Cards like Arcane Signet, you have the absolute opposite problem, same with Thought Vessel, of like, please don't ever cast this before after Jin-Gitaxias. You only want to cast this before, or if Jin-Gitaxias' ability is off cooldown, because we're on cooldown. I don't know the lingo. Regardless, you don't want 2 copies of this card. You don't want Thought Vessel to be even more no maximum hand size. You're just going even on mana. It's not going to feel good. So compared to something like Thread Dynamo, it's just a huge night and day difference. Plus, you kind of have the room for it. You have not really a lot of 4-drops, so having something you can slam with 4 mana and not feel bad about is really nice. Likewise, kind of the same conversation. Sorry, one more thing about this. This also applies to cards like Gilded Lotus. Like anything that taps for like 3 or more mana should be considered here because the value you're going to get from it is very, very high. However, should you play Gilded Lotus? I'll leave that up to you. I don't think so, but Thread Dynamo is good. Okay, back to Palladium Mirror. Likewise, this is very similar to Worn Power Stone in the sense they both can't be tapped the turn they come out, but I do like that they're creatures, and I think that's valuable in and of itself. I don't think you need to play the blue mirror that just taps for a blue mana at 2 mana because I don't think that's worth it. But once again, Palladium Mirror doubled is 4 mana on your next turn. It's not bad. It's 2 2/2s. That's not bad. At least they can attack. At least they can block. At least they're another card that is active on the battlefield. You're playing Lightning Greaves, so these can tap the turn they come down. It's something to consider. I just want you to have access to more mana, especially on the turn with Jin-Gitaxais. I think it's pretty easy to imagine untapping with Jin-Gitaxais and having access to counter spells, double draw spells, all your opponents, one of your opponent's first spell each turn being countered. All of this is really, really cool, but we need to get you there, and cards like Palladium Mirror help you get there. The next few are kind of a set. It's Liberator, Shimmer Mirror. Yeah, it's just these two. There was originally also the colorless one, but I think I cut that, but you can add more to these. And these are just cards that will give your artifacts flash. Liberator is really good because it's artifacts and colorless spells, but you're not running any non-artifact colorless spells, and it doesn't matter. Liberator itself also grows, which is neat and fun, but really you're trying to play it for flash. Shimmer Mirror, of course, is just weaker, but once again, artifact spells have flash is all that matters. Why is this so important? Well, I'm sure you already know Jin-Gitaxais' first ability triggers once a turn and therefore allows you to cast multiple spells, like dividing your spells over multiple turns to get that doubling trigger maybe once, maybe twice more a turn cycle, which can make a huge, huge difference. This also allows your artifact spells, such as Arcane Signet, as I was mentioned before, to still have value in the latter half of the game, because no longer do you really have to think about that argument about, hey, am I going to really use a Jin-Gitaxais trigger on this because I need that mana going forward and I can't really sequence my spells in another way. All of a sudden, you don't have to make that decision. You can hold up the mana, you can hold up other mana, you can wait to an end step and, get the copy and say it's all right. Like, it just gives you a lot more options. These cards are also really, really good at diversifying your openings, because all of a sudden, a lot of those cards, right, that you wanted to spend mana on immediately, once again, the Arcane Signets and the like, can wait until end steps while you hold up interaction, removal, things like that, and you will only deploy them when you feel like you're safe to do so. This is very gives you a lot of options, and also makes it a lot harder for your opponents to act against you, because they know that outside of probably just attacking you over and over, a spell that's going to affect you negatively is a lot riskier to get off when you are holding up all that blue mana at the same time. I think they're very, very good, and I think they are almost must-plays in a deck like this. Of course, there's many other versions. There's like Leyline of Anticipation and a bunch of other cards that give this effect. I'm going to say your mileage will vary. I think Leyline of Anticipation itself is free to play in a deck like this because your four drops. This is the signal for 4 drops. Your four slot in the curve is particularly empty, and so therefore I think you're able to play it and sometimes get the benefit of having it in your opening hand. But realistically, it's not that big of a difference. I think these two are particularly the strongest. There's a few others here and there are cool, but I would start with these two. Moving on, you are mono blue. I really want you to play Harbinger of the Seas. This is a card that is just so powerful and will buy you some time that you need. Now, I know there's always a discussion of whether or not Blood Moon effects are appropriate for Commander, and I've seen the power level of your deck, and I don't think I need to worry about having that discussion. Your deck is clearly at a power level that it is acceptable to play this, so you should be playing this. Realistically, this is not going to win you the game. I know a lot of players feel like, well, you drop this and then the game's over. But once again, gauging your the play group's power level off of your deck, this is going to buy you a turn or two. It's going to put people into a situation where they can't cast all their spells, but in a turn or two, they might have mana rocks, they might have mana dorks, they might have a number of things that enable them to get through this. And once they kill Harbinger, they're going to be all unlocked and ready to go. But that's fine, because you're not putting Harbinger in as a lock piece, you're putting it as a speed bump. That being said, the speed bump is much more important after Jin-Gitaxais is out, because these two pseudo lock pieces are particularly more powerful when they're in tandem, because now your opponents have to manage their mana accordingly and be able to cast multiple spells to get around Jin-Gitaxais. And I think that's a pretty valuable conundrum to put them in. Also, they're, even if they have something like, I'm going to cast this instant draw spell, it's going to get countered, now I'm going to cast Swords to Plowshares off of my planes, they still have to do that, decision if they want to get rid of the Harbinger or get rid of Jin-Gitaxais. I find that to be very, very strong, and I think it's worth playing. There are a lot of 3 mana spells. I figured that was going to happen, but I was worried about it. Thought Monitor. Thought Monitor, I feel, is pretty free to play in this deck. Don't get me wrong, we're probably, at the current base level of the deck and the list, it's probably a lot harder to make this cost 1 mana, but I don't think that's particularly a problem. Not only does this synergize well with the other flash artifact cards I just mentioned, but even off of 3 or 4 artifacts, this becomes a reasonable divination card. That all to say is with Jin-Gitaxais out, this becomes a draw 4, right? And I think that's way, way better. And this is the kind of card I think is very much so worth leaning on Jin-Gitaxais to get that doubling effect and still fine for the rest of the game. If you are playing this and you're having trouble playing getting it to 1 mana or 2 mana, there is an argument to be running more artifacts, but I still want this to be on your radar, that no matter what you build into, to count up your artifacts, your ability to use this and take advantage of it, because it is a very, very strong card. Another artifact creature that I really like is the Reality Chip. Now do note this is a legendary artifact creature, so therefore making a copy of it is not really what you want to do. So there is a bit of that tension where you don't want this to trigger Jin-Gitaxais, or if it does, you're just it's as if you didn't, because you're going to lose one of the copies. That being said, Reality Chip is a particularly strong card. It is one of those cards that I'm universally impressed with, and I really recommend to a lot of people, because not only is it just Future Sight, and Future Sight is a very good ability, it's a Future Sight that scales appropriately to the decks you're going to play. Reality Chip is just as good in a low power budget deck as it is in a high power Jin-Gitaxais deck, because Future Sight as an ability is just good and scales to the power of your deck. So with that in mind, with the artifact synergies, the creatures you're playing, Jin-Gitaxais, you're going to have a lot of reasons to play this card, and once you have Jin-Gitaxais out and you reconfigure it, you are now really, really able to do just a bunch of dumb stuff, right? Being able to cast cards off the top of your deck, play lands off the top of your deck is already very, very good, but when you start mixing that with a lot of your blue spells such as Brainstorm, Scry, Surveils, and all that, it gets better and better. Especially with your ability to use Brainstorm to hide cards on top of your deck and then cast them from there later in the turn or over a turn after. There's some really interesting things you can do to protect your own spells and get away with some stuff that Reality Chip opens up. And that's not just even including having a turn where you just cast 2 or 3 cards off the top of your deck, and that is akin to drawing 2 or 3 cards for free, right? And that's really, really strong. Okay. This is one I'm really, really interested in, and this is Drafna, founder of Latnam. So this is also very specific to the kind of artifacts that you could be playing, but I like this because this works really, really good in your deck, and also works really good when you don't have your commander. Obviously, let's start with that latter half, because this allows you for 3 mana to copy an artifact spell you control. That's particularly cool. It kind of emulates what your commander does, and it's a nice little bit of redundancy. I'll also point out another 2 mana legendary. Oh, I should have said that. This 2 mana legendary and this 2 mana legendary allows you to run Mox Amber a little better. So, something for Mox Amber. But Let me tell you the real thing that really interests me about this. And it's that first line of 1 and a blue, return target artifact you control to its owner's hand. Now, this probably is just meant to be a protection spell, or alternatively, it's meant to be used in tandem with that second ability so that you can basically bring artifacts back to your hand, and when you cast them, you copy them and get a little value from it, though you're spending like 5 additional mana to do that, not even including the mana cost of the artifact. But you have a way to do this for free, right? The second ability of copying artifact. Jin-Gitaxais just allows you to have this as long as it's the first spell you want. So Drafna kind of solves that problem where you have artifacts that you want to play out early, but your commander wants you to play them out later. So you can just later, or just have Drafna, or later play Drafna, and then when you have a chance, return that artifact to your hand, cast it again, and get that additional, copy of it. This also can be useful for things in the deck already that are pretty strong, such as Scepter, where you can use this to reset your Scepter and not having to worry about a way to, make sure you have the right card underneath it, but you're like starting to get pressured. So you can just cast your Scepter early, put something else underneath it, start taking advantage of that, and later in the game, use Drafna to put it back in your hand. Now, there's a lot of other cards that I've seen that put the cards, artifacts back into their hand. Drafna, I think, is the strongest for what it can do for this deck, but you'd be fine to have a number of different spells. I'm sure there's 1 mana spells that do this, that have some utility. I still think this can be the poster child of that section. Very, very cool, very unique, and I think a kind of free card you get to play in a deck like this and take advantage of. Think of turns where you have Jin-Gitaxais, you cast Psychosis Crawler, and then if you had an additional 3 mana with that legendary creature, you could make a 3rd copy of Psychosis Crawler. I know this is probably Magical Christmas Land, but I still think it's really, really cool and something you can definitely do in a deck like this. And I think it's very much so worth running. Moving on, we've got Torrential Gearhulk. I just want to put this in, just another artifact that I think is worth mentioning because it works really, really well with how your deck works right now, where this card benefits from having really good instant sorceries in your graveyard, and you have really, really good instant sorceries. And Torrential Gearhulk is not just a really good Snapcaster mage, it's a beater as well, a blocker, just a very, very strong card. And being able to cast Torrential Gearhulk and getting those 2 copies to cast 2 different spells is really, really good. It is a lot of mana, but I think turns leading up to Jin-Gitaxais, Torrential Gearhulk will do a lot of work while being a blocker and attacker and everything else. So I know it feels like this card is a much lower power level than something like Snapcaster Mage in a deck where you're casting 1 and 2 mana spells, but I think the physical presence and the ceiling of getting 2 copies of this is absolutely worth it. And of course, as mentioned before, this one naturally has Flash, and we've already talked about how good Flash is in this deck, so just having more ways to get triggers from Jin-Gitaxais is rather good. Finally, and I think this is the last card, Impulse is a card that I think is notably missing from the deck. Now, why Impulse? Impulse is straightforwardly look at the top 4, put one of them in your hand, and the rest at the bottom. I want you to play this over Fabricate and over the equation card, Solve the Equation. I recognize this isn't as strong. It is definitely not as strong, but I think its utility as a 2 mana spell and its utility to pick anything from the top 4 makes up for that fact for sure. This can dig you into a counterspell, it can dig you into interaction, it can dig you into a mana rock, it can dig you into a number of things, and it's at that wonderful 2 mana slot that works so well in this deck as is. So I really, really like it here. And once again, if you copy it, it becomes dig through time, kind of, right? You look at the top 8 and you get to pick 2 from it, kind of. Not exactly, but close. And I think that's a pretty good spell to turn Impulse into. If you're being compared to dig through time, you're doing well. So Impulse is just one of those simple blue spells that I think is very powerful, and especially here. And I think that's really what this deck already is made of, right? A series of really powerful, I'm going to say simple, straightforward blue spells that do the job right. And that Impulse will be a really nice addition to all of them. All right, that's going to be all I have right now. I hope this was helpful. This is a really, really fun deck, and I think, especially at its power level, it should do well. I hope this will help the early game. Please let me know. I am curious to see what else we can do. I know there's a few other options we can lean into, but it's either we go really, really heavy on ramp, or we go really heavy in more disruptive early game plays, more effects that are stacks like Winter Moon and things like that, just to slow our opponents down. But those tend to be more divisive, even so more divisive than Jin-Gitaxais. So I wanted to start here with what I think is universally good cards, and not cards that you need to kind of play in the right order or at the right time. But should that not be enough, we can revisit this for sure. Thank you so much, Xavier, for setting the deck. Good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there is a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you, and good luck in brewing and building.